Okay, well, welcome everybody to ULT San Diego here for the Aquarian series. Today's presentation is entitled The Science of Spirituality, and that's going to be given to us by Dr. Ken Campos, and our chairperson for today is Dr. Jean Jennings. All right, so before we begin, a reading from Hermes, May 1975. Initiation into theosophical metaphysics is more than an intellectual or moral enterprise. It is a continuous spiritual exercise in the development of intuitive and cognitive capacities that are the highest available to men, a process that includes from the first a blending of the head and the heart through the interaction of viveka and vairagya, discrimination and detachment. Even our initial apprehension of a statement of theosophical metaphysics involves an ethical as well as mental effort, just as even the smallest application of a theosophical injunction to our moral life requires some degree of mental control and the deeper awareness, universal and impersonal in nature. This that comes from our higher cognitive capacities. Moral growth for a theosophist presupposes the silent worship of abstract or noumenal nature, the only divine manifestation that is the one ennobling the religion of humanity. So we give to you our very own Dr. Ken Campos.
Well, welcome everybody. Very excited to be here today. And so today, as Monica just told us, the title is The Science of Spirituality. And today is March 1st here in 2025. With this wonderful artwork we have, kind of tapping into what Monica just read, I'll read the quote from Hermes. When one acts from the depths of silence, tapped by meditation with deliberation and cool precision, one becomes a serene master of all the vestures and the sovereign ruler of one's divine sphere. So indeed, silence is a very significant thing. Now, in this series of talks, this is the third of three presentations here on the Aquarian Saturday weekends. We have the inspirational photograph here in the San Diego Lodge and the quote for the last two talks. The philosophy of perfection of Krishna, the religion of responsibility of the Buddha, and the science of spirituality of Shankara constitute the Pythagorean teaching of the Aquarian age of universal enlightenment. So this ties us back to the Pythagoras, the great Greek scholar, mathematician, musician, and the divine Tetractys. The talks here are three different stepping stones on the spiritual path. The philosophy of perfection, referring to the Bhagavad Gita, the religion of responsibility, referring to Buddhism, and our theosophical perspective on it, especially from the voice of the silence. And today, I'll delve into the science of spirituality, or Advaita Vedanta, from Shankara. And then end with a little bit on the from the theosophical tenets from Raghavan Iyer's article on the spiritual evolution. Let's see if I can minimize that for the moment. There we go. So Shankaracharya, who is also called Adi Shankara, was a nearly mythological figure from the 8th century of the Common Era here, AD, an Indian Brahmin from the Brahmin class. He was a scholar and philosopher. Shankara is credited with codifying one of the major 6 schools of Indian philosophy and classical looking at Indian philosophy. His school is called Advaita Vedanta. And today, somehow it's, I think, I'll say mistakenly or maybe commonly thought of as representing all of Hinduism, but in fact, it's one of 6 major schools. It's very popular, and in recent decades, it's become a very dominant Hindu philosophy. And just to remind everybody, from the British colonial days, when they were looking at this Indian subcontinent, there was this great variety of religions and practices, and they actually invented the idea of Hinduism by calling it one religion, even though it's a multitude of different religions and various deities are involved and multiple philosophical systems. Essentially, it's about a 3,000-year-old conversation that's been going on in Indian spiritualism and philosophy. And Adi Shankara, his system for spiritual development had a number of requirements. Of course, in the 800s AD, he was part of the classical Varna caste system in the Brahmins, the highest priestly caste. And the Brahmins were people that, in his idea, were the only ones qualified to study the Vedas. And of course, of the Brahmins, it would be only the male Brahmins. So again, in the kind of, you might say that misogynistic, Piscean age mentality, only men could study the Vedas. Originally, supposedly the Vedas were an oral tradition that was revealed to the rishis. The oldest written Vedas, just to go over the Vedas real quick, was from about 1,500 AD or before the Common Era, or then the Human Era, where it's 8,500. And now we're in the 2020s or the 12,020s in this Human Era numbering of the years. The oldest Vedas were finally written down about 3,500 years ago. So again, this conversation has been going on for quite a long time. And now we as modern theosophists are participating in it through various scholars and commentators. Recently, with the ULT, we have Raghavan Iyer to credit for much of our understanding. According to the Adi Shankara, there was a precise method for chanting or singing the textual materials contained in the Vedas, and this was based on the tone, the note, the accent, prosody. So even tying with Pythagoras and music, there's a musical aspect to the teaching of the Vedas that you might say would have an impact on our right brain or our non-cognitive, our non-verbal brain. Many people believe that this strict teaching of the Vedas is still going on today in this century among the Vedantin Brahmins. Adi Shankara also had another set of requirements that, in addition to being from the Brahmin caste, you had to have a certain personality and devotion to the Vedas, and also had to have a preliminary understanding of the Vedas and having studied them extensively. In my looking at the Vedas, I really just thought there was only a spiritual aspect, but I realized that over the centuries, the Hindu Indians had developed this very elaborate and complex system of human knowledge, scientific knowledge, medical knowledge, and of course, the thing that in my naivete I thought was the main part, which is only spiritual knowledge, but it really had all parts of human knowledge and understanding, political, social organization. And I would say, looking at it for a few minutes, and I'll show you a couple of slides, I'm viewing it as more elaborate than the Dewey Decimal System in the library for organizing knowledge and information. The word Ved is in Sanskrit, knowledge. So that's what we're talking about, knowledge here, knowing things. We have different words that derive from that. And this Sanskrit Vedas from 3,500 years ago, or even earlier, was revealed information and recorded by the rishis. Now, of course, in theosophy, we have very different ideas about anthropogenesis and when humans really came onto the scene. So you might say this is a more recent revelation of this knowledge that was recorded by the rishis and revealed to those adepts and masters. Very quickly here, just to give an overview of what Adi Shankara thought was the preliminary requirement in order to get into Advaita Vedanta. There's the 4 Vedas. They're the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, the Sama Veda, the Atharva Veda, and they were on different topics, you might say. The Rig Veda, hymns of praises, the Yajur Veda, rituals, sacrifices, mantras, the Samavedas on chants and musical aspects, again tying to Orpheus and Pythagoras and the Greeks with music and sounds and uh, scales of tones. The fourth Veda is uh, the Atharva Veda. These are hard words for me to say, related to health, wealth, protection. And you might say that the Ayurvedic medicine of interest to me comes from this fourth aspect of the Vedas. Now, each of the four Vedas is a set of books and writings, and each of them have four subcategories. Some Hita Vedas, mantras and benedictions, the Brahmanas, the daily rituals, the Aranyakas, the sacrifices, and interpretations of the ceremonies, and then something called the Upanishads. It's 1/4 of all the four classical Vedas. And this is commentaries and explanations about the other aspects of each of these four subsets of human knowledge and social organization, politics, and spiritual understanding. Upanishads is interesting. It is the last part of the Vedas, so it's also called Vedanta, which means the end of the Vedas or the fourth section of the Vedas. And just to make things confusing, after the original Vedas were written down, other commentators added to the post-Vedic Upanishads. So they're all called Upanishads, just to make it confusing for people like me. And then later philosophers and writers use the word Vedanta to mean those later religious philosophical systems. And of course, the one we're talking about today of Adi Shankara's version is Advaita Vedanta. And this, the A in Sanskrit and in Greek is for not something. So Advaita means not two or non-dual. And this, I would say, is currently now in this century, the most popular form of modern Hindu thought overall. And even here in the United States, you see Advaita Vedanta teachings in schools. It's really gotten integrated into a lot of common thinking. And although there might have been other people that created or thought about or wrote about Advaita Vedanta, it's really credited to Adi Shankara. And soon after this man, who's also called Shankaracharya, one of his devotees developed a Dvaita Vedanta, or a dualist version of Vedanta. And then there's a modified version, et cetera, et cetera. But focusing just on the main one here is Advaita Vedanta, the science of spirituality. So in all of his work and teaching and understanding and learning, this Adi Shankara, person who characterized and codified Advaita Vedanta, came up with the idea that true knowledge of the divine, of the Brahman, was available only through the Vedas. So it's kind of surprising they had a huge emphasis on the written tradition, this thousands of year old tradition. So he thought this was very important. And his epistemological position was that in order to gain knowledge of the Brahman, or this absolute ineffable thing that in Theosophy we call the first fundamental principle, one had to know about the Vedas. However, mere book learning wasn't enough. He added that after learning and internalizing the Vedas, you were then supposed, as a student, to meditate and contemplate on them. And then through this process of meditation and contemplation, you could have an experience. You would have a sort of an understanding that perhaps went beyond the words and the chants and the songs and the mantras and the tonalities, and that this experience would be to understand that you as the individual person, the student of the Vedas, the student in Adi Shankara's Vedanta school, was really identical with the Atman, the higher self, which was an important concept in his thinking, and that this Atman was identical in its own way to the Brahman. And this experience then, resulting from this firm foundation in the knowledge and the pedantic aspect, is called liberation. And in this aspect of Hinduism, this liberation is very important. It's also called moksha. And here's a little quote about moksha. The cycle of rebirth only comes to an end with moksha, liberation. That's liberation from the cycle of rebirth, death and incarnation, reincarnation. Moksha is the destruction of the delusion that takes place when the individual becomes enlightened. Moksha is the process of merging with God, or the Brahman, or as someone prefer to say, recognizing our identity with God. After the Hindus, then the later Buddhists called this same word, moksha, they called it nirvana, or the cessation of rebirth. So in his life and in his studies, after his early days as a young Brahmin and studying the Vedas, Adi Shankara was a great orator and lecturer and interviewer, and he traveled and met with other spiritual leaders around India and other parts of the world. He debated and learned and taught from these other spiritual leaders, and then developed his own system, what we're calling Advaita Vedanta. And in southwestern India, he is thought to have started his own school, and I have a picture of that in a moment. Oddly enough, though, in Advaita Vedanta, he de-emphasized rituals and ceremonies, some of the things in the Rig Veda, for instance, the breath work, the pranayama, asceticism. He de-emphasized those things as being not sufficient really to gain this experience of being identical to the Atman, and that he favored literal study of the Vedas and then this meditational experience. So his key concepts in Advaita Vedanta are the Atman as the higher self, and then the Brahman as the ultimate causeless cause or source of reality. And he wrote many commentaries on a variety of sacred literature, including the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita. This temple that I mentioned is attributed to the place where Adi Shankara settled down after all of his traveling around the world in India, and where he taught his disciples. And today it's called the Sannidhi Temple, and it's part of a monastery there in southern India, southwestern India. And it's somewhat legendary, so it's hard to know if he really was there or just thought to have been there. But just like the place in northern India where the Buddha, Gautama Siddhartha, taught, I would say there's probably some grain of truth and some reality that he did teach people there. And here's the modern temple, a photograph of it, where Adi Shankara taught his disciples. So this is one of those holy places like Crotona in southern Italy for Pythagoras, or the place in northeastern India where the Gautama Siddhartha taught. Around the 800s in the AD years, when Adi Shankara was thought to be alive, even the dates of his birth and death are somewhat mysterious, but most people agree that he was only a 32-year-old. Many of the stories say that he died young and that he lived around the 800s. Around that time, as the older Vedic system of rituals and sacrificial ceremonies was declining in popularity, bhakti was increasing in popularity. So this sort of love-like devotional practices to various deities, the pujas and those sorts of things. And he wrote a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, trying to stay current with popular society back in the 800s. And this was an example of the bhakti type of literature, the Gita. And this ties us back to the first lecture back in January of these 3 talks on the philosophy of perfection of Krishna. However, in the second talk last month in February, was focusing on the Buddhist idea. And of course, in our Voice of the Silence, we have that section on the 2 paths, in which moksha, or liberation, is mentioned as one of the 2 paths to nirvana. But in our Theosophical and Blavatsky's version in the Voice of the Silence, she strongly prefers the other path, the Bodhisattva path, the way of renunciation. Shankara has these key concepts of Brahman, this ultimate source of reality, which I would say is very much like our Theosophical and HPB's idea in the proem of the first fundamental principle. He says that it's abstract and unknowable, has no attributes, so neti, it's not this, or not that. So really it's abstract. But just to make things confusing, in writings and commentaries attributed to Adi Shankara, he also talks about, in addition to this unknowable attributes, this quality of Brahman, there's another version of Brahman that has attributes in our world of manifested form. But because it's a non-dual system, we really have to say that Adi Shankara never believed there were 2 Brahmans, but really only one Brahman. Although there is this talk about this other qualified version that has attributes. The non-dual concept is key in his thinking and his philosophizing and what he's presented to us with Advaita Vedanta. And the belief that there actually are real things that we perceive was one of his understandings of our human experience, that there's an actual real thing in the real world at this level of a manifestation. So we say our bodies are real, the table's real, the house we live in is real, the food we're eating, it has a real aspect. However, the illusion or the Maya, which he didn't talk about a lot, but actually had stories about it, that he believed that it wasn't just simply a misperception of things, but that it was an active, deliberate mental function that we did very specifically and very actively by creating these illusions about real reality. And that this was a normal process for us humans, and that part of the work of the non-dual Advaita Vedanta devotee was to understand that our brains and our minds and our senses were doing this active, deliberate thing to sort of deceive us or to fool us in a sense. And in order to explain this, I'd say rather key concept of the non-dual, Adi Shankara is credited as using some of the Upanishads and other examples. One of them is the story of a coiled snake that one might encounter in some place or another, say in a darkened area. And then for a moment, someone flashes a brighter light on, and you see that it's not a snake at all that you were scared of and frightened about, having all these thoughts and reactions and perceptions and understanding of the snake. Then when light turns on, you see it's just a rope that's coiled up that you mistakenly thought was a snake. So indeed, this gets to that idea that the illusion or the Maya is a very active mental function, and it has an emotional content as well, because we're scared of the snake. But then when you have the light on, you see that it's really just a rope and nothing to be scared of at all. But it's still really just a rope. I mean, it's a real rope. And that is Adi Shankara's analogy. You might say like Aesop's fables or Jesus's parables. It's an analogy for something, that this identity and this reality that we see around us is actually really not a rope, but actually the Brahman. It's actually this divine, ineffable principle that has taken these various forms, and that we can see that the forms around us, houses, cars, trees, animals, people, all these circumstances, the ocean, storms, weathers, monsoons, all of this stuff is in reality actually just a rope coiled up, actually the Brahman. The second example that I think is, both of these two examples are really quite informative to understand Advaita Vedanta, is about clay in the hands of a potter or a sculptor or a maker. And the clay, this sort of plain thing in and of itself, can be formed into bowls or statues or implements. You can make dice out of it, all kinds of things you can do with clay. But ultimately, in reality, it's just clay. And so, again, Adi Shankara is teaching this basic idea that all the various forms we experience are actually, in reality, the Brahman, the clay. And that applies even to us as humans, our self, our body, our mind, our personality. All of that is really the Atman. And that's the realization in the pathway, the spiritual path that Adi Shankara taught his spiritual science, is that you learn about the Vedas. And so again, just to repeat, Tattvamasi, thou art that. So that's the realization that Adi Shankara was claiming we could make. And then to bring us to some latter parts, as the picture we have here of Raghavan Iyer says, these three keys of the Gita, Buddhism, and Advaita Vedanta are together form the ideas of Pythagoras. And so last November, there was an opportunity to have one of these Aquarian series talks on the divine tetractys, or sacred geometry. And you might say that the Brahman that Adi Shankara talks about could be symbolized as a point and then emanating into a circle. So we get into some of the geometry. And a little thing before more geometry, just roaming around the internet, I found this idea by C.W. Leadbeater, a non-United Lodge of Theosophists author, in a writing he has called Pythagoras, a Future World Leader from 1913. I'm not sure where Leadbeater is getting this information, but he writes that Master K.H. was a reincarnation of Pythagoras, and that before being reincarnated as Master K.H., he was Nagarjuna, the great Buddhist teacher of Buddhist philosophy. So just a curious little tidbit about one of the masters that we look at here in the ULT. So back to the geometry part. Last November, we were talking about the divine tetractys, which is this equilateral triangle. There was one aspect of Pythagoras's mystical teachings which really wasn't spoken about at the time, and it turns out it's a circle, which later Euclid, and doing his geometry, made more emphasis on circles and ratios of circles and pi and that sort of thing. So it could be that this initial circle is a manifestation, or possibly representing one of the later logoi, as Blavatsky talks about in the proem. The circle of Pythagoras could be the boundless circle, which is symbolic of potential manifestation, or the noumenon, as we talk about various levels of reality, starting from the Brahman, or this boundless first fundamental principle. And then within a circle, geometrically, it's easy enough to draw an equilateral triangle. And that brings us back to the tetractys symbol of the talk earlier in November. And the beginning of the logoic emanations into manifested reality could be represented by the circle and the triangle, or in Adi Shankara's non-dual aspect, the Brahman emanating to form a world of manifested form. And then from article on the American Theosophist, 1914, a little quote here. The efficacy of Pythagoras' teaching has lasted through the centuries. Its flame has never been extinguished, but religiously preserved and transmitted from generation to generation by the elect, to whom has been confided by degrees this sacred deposit. He stands an exponent of those immutable laws that rule man's pilgrimage through the vicissitudes of life, of that power which transmutes sorrow into blessings, darkness into light, death into immortality, of that love which makes man a master of the wisdom of the world. The Pythagoric life is a specimen of the greatest perfection in virtue and wisdom which can be obtained by man in the present state. So that's an inspiring little commentary there. And then a little more about Pythagoras, since Ragavan Iyer ties the Gita, Buddhism, and Advaita Vedanta to Pythagoras' ideas for the Aquarian age. So HPV writes in her glossary about Pythagoras, the most famous mystic philosophers, born in Samos about 586 BC, he seemed to have traveled all over the world and to have culled his philosophy from various systems to which he had access. Thus, he studied the esoteric sciences with Brahmaneses of India, astronomy and astrology in Chaldea and Egypt. He is known to this day in the former country under the name of, that would be in India, the former country, under the name of Yavanacharya, or the Ionian teacher, from Ionian Greek area. After returning to Greece and the Mediterranean, he settled in Crotona in Magna Graecia, where he established a college to which very soon resorted all the best intellects of the civilized centers. His father was one Nemisarchus of Samos, and was a man of noble birth and learning. It was Pythagoras who was the first to teach the heliocentric system, and who was the greatest proficient in geometry of his century. It was he also who created the word philosopher, composed of the two words meaning lover of wisdom, the philosophos. As the greatest mathematician, geometer, and astronomer of historical antiquity, and also the highest of metaphysicians and scholars, Pythagoras has won imperishable fame. He taught reincarnation, as is professed in India, and much else of the secret wisdom, which we're calling the perennial philosophy, or the theosophy. And then a few sentences here as we end up the presentation today from the Theosophical Tenets. There's an article from Hermes in that book, Theosophical Tenets. The first one is, man is the compound being simultaneously experiencing two worlds, inner and outer. The fascinating concept. So we have our objects of sense outside of us, the outer world, and then this inner meditational world. That's very important in Advaita Vedanta to be able to come to this realization. And then another sentence from Raghavan Iyer's article. It's an article in which he really summarizes all of theosophy, you might say. He emphasizes, quote, the classical Indian scriptures resonate with the authentic voice of the verbum, uncorrupted by time and human ignorance. And then again, another quote emphasizing some of the doctrines that we hold near and dear. Quote, the progress of man in harmony with cyclic law is facilitated by a mature grasp of karma and rebirth. These twin doctrines of responsibility and hope unravel many of the riddles of life and nature. And indeed, responsibility gets us back to the Gita, that religion of responsibility, Buddhism, religion of responsibility. And the hope of the Gita and of Advaita to come to these realizations of our unity with both Atman and the Brahman. And with that, let me go ahead and stop sharing and take us into a period of time for some comments, commentary, any of the ideas on these 3 or 4 ideas, you might say, of the Bhagavad Gita from Krishna, Gautama Siddhartha's Buddhic morality and teachings, and then lastly, the Advaita Vedanta from Shankaracharya, all culminating to summarize and to encapsulate some of Pythagoras' teachings. Yes, Gene, give us some initial...
No. We'll just jump right into the question ocean. Thank you for that grand comprehensive tour, no doubt. And we visited several places around the globe. Let's ask, just to get things kicked off, what's the difference between the true esoteric teaching, if we could ever fathom what that might be, versus Buddhism or Advaita or the Vedas or what Pythagoras taught?
Yes, a fascinating question. What is that ultimate distinction? I would say in Blavatsky's writing, particularly starting with the beginning in the poem, the esoteric teaching, I believe she's focusing on the stanzas of Dzyan as something that is contained in the Tibetan wisdom, as mysterious and almost inscrutable as those stanzas are. We really have to rely on a lot of commentaries to unpack them and understand them. But also in this, you might say, true esoteric teaching, we have these first 3 fundamental principles. And the idea, I think, is connected to the Brahman that Adi Shankara really tried very hard to understand. And curiously, Gautama Siddhartha said, don't worry about it. Don't waste your time. Don't think about that stuff. Let's just focus on human morality. So it's another perspective on, you might say, another part of the elephant, like the blind man touching the elephant, one seeing the rope for the tail, another feeling it's like a snake for the trunk, and another one saying it's like a tree with the legs. So we're really looking at this esoteric philosophy from many different angles. And I think these 3 and 4, if we add Pythagoras, give different perspectives on that mysterious, ineffable, esoteric teachings.
Okay, great. Thank you. Clearly, we have some more questions based on what you said, but let's open it up. I mean, based on what individuals have heard, anything worth clarifying or, yes, Desiree.
Hola. Hi there, everybody.
Evening.
Yeah, I'm just following up on your question, Jean, and it would seem to me that what unites all of these practices and belief systems is the understanding that all life is unified and comes from a single source, is expressed, that oneness is expressed in variation, but that all life is interconnected. I would think that is probably the most, I don't know, the grand piece of it all.
Okay. I love it only because, it's like those Zen koans when we're trying to track things down. So let's then play a game, and Ken, you can join in with this. If what Ken pointed out, Sankaracharya said, neti neti, and if the senses are the cause for our perception of division, and if we can never conceive of that, is what is interconnected what we're really looking for?
Mhm.
And I will say I don't disagree with you at all, Desiree. I do. I believe you deeply. But how do we resolve this apparent conundrum,
Yes,
given
and
that the boundless has no parts?
mhm. Yes, that interconnection is I think the fascinating thing here, Gene, and it would be the interconnection with stuff like the senses, the objects of senses, and curiously enough, Blavatsky talks about our five ordinary senses, but really there's three others, giving us 10. Back to that to track this concept of 10 or the decad. So that's another curious thing, and yet um, we have from some Hinduism and popular ideas, the thought of Maya and illusion as being an essential aspect that the things we're seeing are really not real. They're like in a dream, that really through another degree of consciousness, like Turiya, we have the waking, dreaming, deep, dreamless sleep consciousness. As we're in Turiya, we'll see that these objects in our ordinary manifested world are just dreamlike objects. However, Shankaracharya was more of a realist in saying, well, there really is a rope. Even though you thought it was a snake, there really is a rope there. It doesn't disappear from being a rope. It's still a rope. And I would say part of the paradox of that is that it's a rope in this level of consciousness. And even yourself, Gene, when you've talked about different levels of consciousness, like the threshold, the witness on the threshold, that in different levels of consciousness, there's going to be different degrees of substance that we can experience. And that in the esoteric teaching, we have the idea of a noumenal substance that emanates from this Brahman, this ultimate thing that we can't describe in words or conceptualize with our mammalian brains. And there's this potential substance which then emanates through different degrees of consciousness, which we then maybe talk about as the septenary nature of man and of reality. And that it goes from these more abstract and refined aspects of reality. Each level of consciousness or each level of these principles will have its own objects in it and its own sensory apparatus in it. And so I think that understanding that is part of the way to unravel this seeming paradox and say, well, what's the line that's coming through all of that? And one might say the line is awareness, a function of awareness.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dave.
Thanks. Oh, I was thinking maybe we should drop the word interconnection and think of it as Ken was saying, the rope as interconnection, if that makes any sense.
If
Maybe
it makes sense to you.
interconnection makes us look in the wrong place, maybe. If we think of interconnection, we're going to look more to that which really unifies
Okay, so inter
versus inner, right?
versus inner points to that which unifies. But if we're trying to unify things, can we ever find the common source that is the unity? I mean, how would and Ken mentioned some of these things in his presentation that we can use as tools. How do we come to understand that unity? Or not even a unity, because to say something is a unity means that all things have to be put together.
Well, that which you want to know, you must become, maybe. Maybe we have to look at it that way.
Okay, so and that would impinge on some of what Ken suggested. Well, before we get off on that tangent, do we have other questions concerning these immense topics?
Well, I wonder if we can add something about that we've discussed in previous classes, that the difference or the lack of difference between the knower and the field. And that is not, I often think that the field is really other knowers, other beings, other that like ourselves, in evolution as well. So, can we see the unity in all the differentiation, that it's all just that one life? That comes to mind, because it's one thing to call it Maya, like I can call what I see on the screen here Maya, but it's not Maya. It's made up of many wonderful intelligences, so who are part of that same one life. So when we think of the one life and absolute, nothing is excluded from it.
Okay, thank you. Ken, comments?
Yes, yes. As we strive to understand this unity idea, I really think that as Laura was saying when we talked about Kshetra and Kshetrajana, that this function that and Adi Shankara is pointing us towards, and maybe even in chapter 11 of the Gita, is pointing us to an experience. And even Adi Shankara says that experience arises only after you have studied the Vedas, the actual written scriptures, learned about them, and then you can meditate. And then after that meditational process, or within that process, you can have an experience. And perhaps it's like the Japanese Zen masters, that it's an experience that you can't talk about. So this understanding would be like an experiential realization of this ultimate unity. And you might say that these different spiritual techniques that one does, and even though Adi Shankara de-emphasized, the pranayama or asceticism, or doing rituals and whatnot, chanting, I think they're just methodologies and techniques that we can do in our manifested day-to-day world. With the 24-hour clock, we can do certain behaviors and activities that would help get us ready to go in the direction of having this experience of this unity. And indeed, as Laura was saying, there's different consciousnesses. We do talk about the elementals that make up things in our materialistic world, our manifested world, and that I would venture to say that in each of the different levels, as so we talk about this dangerous next level up, the astral light, or the Akashic type area, where William Pond Judge writes about the Kamaloka and different humans that maybe are on their way to Devachan. Just say, well, what's going on in those different areas of reality and of substance? Each of them does have a reality to it, and each of them does have an awareness and substance, although at different degrees of substance.
Okay, thank you. And again, and not that you have to answer this now, but something perhaps for us all to reflect on. What is consciousness? What is these different alleged states of consciousness? And maybe Shobha can help us out with another clarifying question or comment. Shobha.
I don't know what consciousness is. I'm still struggling on this level where I am and trying to live my life. But I was just looking something that you said, Eugene, and what Desiree said about the unity and all. And then also this question of, how do we even reconcile all these things with all the concepts that we hear? I had to go to the light on the path. And I remember that right in the beginning, it starts with these little statements. And one of them says, kill out all sense of separateness. And then when it talks about it, it says, yet stand alone and isolated. But it explains it beautifully in the notes where it says that you cannot separate yourself from people and think that you are unique, because you may have all the faults that you see in others already in you. And the last sentence in that note says something so much that we can ponder on. It says, abstain because it is right to abstain, not that you yourself shall be kept clean. I find that beautiful, because we can talk about separateness. We are separate, but we are connected. We are all one. The horrible things that we see around us are probably there in us too. What do I mean probably? I am sure that they are in us too. How much of digging have we done within ourselves? Then I think of page 40 of The Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, saying that at each stage we are discovering more and more, and there are still so many veils to be unveiled. So I just feel that it's a process. At one moment we may feel we are all part of one whole. At another moment we may feel it is important for us to separate and work on it individually. So there is this apparent contradiction, which is really no contradiction at all. Comments?
Apparent contradictions. Okay, Ken, you are in the midst of expressing breath.
Yes. So I like, I'll jump in with the apparent contradiction first and then go back to consciousness. So one thing from the world of physical science, of course, is this idea of light. And in modern Western physical science, we talk about photons. And then, of course, our subatomic physicists, theorists describe the photon as a massless particle, which already has a paradox in it. How can you have a particle with no mass? but that's what the particle is of a photon. And then others say that, well, it's actually a wave. So it's like a wave-like packet of energy. So again, there's a paradoxical duality, even at that level. And one thing that Desiree here in the lodge likes to talk about is the fractalization, or this self-same reflection, or like Hermes Trismegistus saying, as above, so below. So again, this almost paradoxical duality in our world of form, where we have the gunas, different qualities and aspects of things, shows up in various ways. So given that that's part of the nature of our manifested world, is having dualities and paradoxes and border lines and distinctions between one thing and another. Say, like at the seashore, at the beach, you're kind of between the dirt of the continent and the water of the ocean. You're in this kind of liminal boundary space, sort of like on a threshold between one thing and the other. There's just states of awareness. And the idea that Blavatsky has talked about with regard to time. So certainly in Western science, time is a really important concept and thing that we normally experience, and we talk about, and we live our lives with time and clocks and all that sort of thing in our manifested world of form and whatnot. My understanding is that Blavatsky writes that time is really a cessation of states of consciousness, which does bring us back to that mysterious question of what is consciousness. But to say that time is just different states of awareness that come one after the other and give us the perception of time, or the sensation of time, or the illusion of time, is fascinating. And again, from Western science, we have Albert Einstein and his theories about time dilation, which actually he was taking some ideas from the late 1800s on Lorentz transformations. And that if you're moving close to the speed of light, the rate of time flow is very different than if you're an observer, rather stationary, not moving at the speed of light. So even time can be different. And there's something in the 1930s and 40s that was written about called the twin paradox. We have two twins. One goes on a spaceship traveling at the speed of light, and he experiences time at his rate. The other twin on Earth experiences time at his rate, twin A and twin B. Then the traveling twin comes back, and he's very much younger because he's been traveling close to the speed of light. So time relative to the Earth-bound twin is going at a slower rate. So his perception of awareness and things is different than the other twin. And so the other twin on Earth is old, the traveling twin is young. So it's a curious thing about states of consciousness and our physical reality and awareness. That leading then to the mysterious question of consciousness. And I'm very excited to hear what other people think about the nature of consciousness. And for me, I would say it's a mystical experience to understand what consciousness is. That's almost beyond expressing in words. One thing that we hear about from some of our members in the lodge is near-death experiences. And then we have this common phrase of going to the light or don't go to the light, you know, to stay in your life or to leave your life and go on to the next phase. So the idea of light, I think, is contained in the Kabbalistic tree of life, like on page 200 in the Secret Doctrine, Volume 1. The first emanation in the tree of life is Kether, which is described as a ball of light, a white light. And I've heard that explained in some Neoplatonic nomenclature as the first manifestation of the thought of God into the world of form. That brings us to the Logoic idea. But then you might say, what is the thought of God, or what is the awareness? And we're getting back to this consciousness, this time thing, this awareness. And so for me, consciousness ultimately is going to be a function, like awareness ing, like a verb, and not connected to any entity per se, or a being, or a Jehovah, or an Odin, or some god, a Zeus on Mount Olympus, but really a function of the universe, of the structure of our reality. And, you know, talking about the breath of Brahman, the in-breath and the out-breath, that both the Manvantara and the Pralaya have an experience is happening. So there's a consciousness that's going on. One might say it's more of an awake consciousness or more of a dreaming consciousness. But even at that level of this abstract, you know, Brahmanic Manvantara idea, there's the concept of a breath or an awareness. And I think that gets us back to the one life. What is this one life? I would say it's the function of awareness ing. That's an inherent aspect of this world that we're experiencing, this world that we're living in.
Okay, so again, we'll say thank you for that, and then we'll say, and that's the problem with words. And we will say, in regards to time, Patanjali gives us the key word that you mentioned, succession. And when we are able to let go of succession, we can master time. And we have to also, in the near-death experience, let's switch gears for a moment, is another one that we've got to be careful about, because the near-death experience from a theosophical point of view, as HPB tells us, and we just had this little discussion in our Wednesday night class, when we look up the name Yaka Burma in the glossary. She says, his experience, as wonderful as it was only his experience with the spiritual ego, which is not the absolute. And that consciousness, as you say, as a function, clearly the way we understand it, and HPB points this out in one or two places, conscious. She says, whenever you have to put two things together, it's not the one. And so even being conscious necessitates an of, which is an object, means that we are already lost in trying to, as you would say, experientially realize the ground out of which consciousness itself arises. But then I think there were two in the chat before we jumped to Laura. One was from Vimal. Could you please explain the divine Tetractys in more detail? And we would just say before Ken jumps on that there are several that we can talk about. So if we think there's only one, we're already in trouble. And then Maluka gives us lovely talk, Ken. And then I think she pulls a quote from the Mahatma letters. When arrives the period of full individual consciousness, in quotes, which precedes that of absolute consciousness in the Pati Nirvana. That's a book. because we have to understand what those words in quote mean. We have to understand what that absolute consciousness means, and we have to understand what that state of parinirvana is. This lost personal life becomes as a torn out page in the great book of lives. And that pertains again to what we might just summarize as the loss of a life or the loss of a soul, without even a disconnected word left to mark its absence. And she puts at the bottom of the Mahatma letters. So clearly, much to think on. But again, when we're thinking with words, we're going to get in trouble, but we need the words to get us to a point where we can think without words. And Patanjali explains that piece to us. And he also says, or she also says, could be, who knows the soul, that even though the universe ceases to exist for the one that experiences that unique state, it does not fail to continue to exist for all others. And at the same time, the one that lives in that state is also living in the world with all others. And Krishna talks about that unique trifold simultaneous experience in the Gita. And some of what Ken was mentioned in terms of Kshetra and Kshetrajna, you can look at in the chapter 13 on the Bhagavad Gita, because it is a chapter of wisdom par excellence. But Ken, Divine Tetractys, you mentioned that during your talk. Your perspective on that?
Yes. So the Tetractys is a symbol to start with, and in one of Helen Valborg's symbol articles, she goes into some detail about the symbology of it. And it's basically an equilateral triangle, the way the geometry is drawn, with 10 points within it. And those are, the apex point, or like a manifestation, you might say the third logos coming into form, and then one, and then we have after the 1 point, and then below it are 2 points. That one could be a noumenal thought about a number or an actual number, or both. Again, a paradoxical thing. Then we get into the duad of the 2, then a triad, and that triplicate triad thing is very important. And in some theosophical hymns and chants, we have the talking about Father, Mother, God, or we have Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Again, a triadic relationship. And in Helen Valborg's article, she talks about part of the Tetractys, the 3 going into the 4, the 3 maybe being symbolized by a marriage with a priest at the apex, the bride and bridegroom as the 2 parts, and then the 4 behind them would be the bridesmaids and the best man, that sort of people, the other people witnessing that. And then out of that triad then can emerge a 4-part thing. So we have the 1 dot, the 2 dots, the 3 dots, and 4 dots. And so then we get to a manifested form of 4. And then the Tetractys is symbolic of various things. As Jean mentioned, there's more than one. In fact, Pythagoras talked about 12 of them relating to different aspects, like the Vedas, about different aspects of spirituality, of social organization, political organization, science, and those sorts of things, interpersonal relationships. So the Tetractys is a geometrical symbol that contains within it a doorway to various teachings about life in the world and the esoteric philosophy.
Great, thank you very much. And again, we would just jump from the psychological side to the voice of the silence. And that Tetractys is acknowledged in that little text from the perspective of the purified mind, or that childlike state that is now not having a near-death experience, but as Jacob Burma could, consciously communicates with the ground of its spiritual ego, which is able to reflect the higher, deeper truths that pertain to the universe and the laws that give rise to the universe and the grounds that give rise to those laws. And so the Tetractys for the would-be initiate is truly a state of being that surpasses Maya, and yet they don't disregard Maya as not being real because, as Patanjali says, the universe exists for the others and it is important to be there for those others. But at the same time, there is a totally unique experience that is going on that no one from the outside will ever know, that is moving in an evolutionary way to even further transform that divine Tetractus aspect of our nature on the different planes of being. But I did promise Laura I would get back to her.
Yeah.
Laura and then Maluka.
Yes, well, thank you. I would really like to hear what Nancy had to say. She did leave a comment there, and it's very good.
Oh, thank
Do
you.
you-
I'm kind of just chiming in here. I'm just, my thoughts here. Consciousness to me is a form of evolution, like where you start from. Maybe, for instance, a kindergartner goes on and has different thoughts and where they are in their learnings and so forth. And I also think I like a lot of science, and dimensions, I think, is correlated with all that. They talk about which dimensions you're in, and I think this all correlates together, and everybody from their karma, maybe where they start in consciousness, because sometimes people put levels to consciousness. What level of consciousness are you in? So these are just, I think a lot of this is correlated together with all these three components. And has any of you had a near-death experience? So therefore, or the doctor says you're in and out of consciousness. Which level are you on? What plane are you on? These are just thoughts to what you're talking about.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And one thing again, we'll lean on something that HPB suggested. There is consciousness and there is content.
Mm-hmm.
Dimensionality is content within consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Levels and differentiations are content within consciousness. And so, although, as Laura suggested with the question on the elementals and consciousness, all particulates within consciousness can experience aspects of consciousness, the consciousness itself is something different than all of the phases of content that arise within it.
Do
That's
you
no
think
different.
do you think it has something to do with the observer, though? The observer that's observing all this.
When and again, this can be
I'm just
really looked at in each person, as you said, if you've ever had a near-death experience,
Mm-hmm.
each person will interpret that differently. And that's what the teachers say part of the problem is, because the occult interpretation, as they say, requires training of those very cognitive faculties and functions that we need to interpret it correctly. And so we have a lot of views, we have a lot of points of view, we have a lot of perspectives, we have a lot of windows that we look through to define things, to use words, to generate philosophies, to have points of view, to apply it metaphysically, to apply it mathematically, to apply it philosophically, etc., all of which are phases of content within consciousness. And we haven't yet arisen and acknowledged the consciousness that gives rise to the content. So again, just some thoughts, but let me jump to Maluka, and then Laura's got her hand back up. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I was thinking, I recently was thinking about the Tetractus as well. I did a talk a long time ago. And one of the things that struck me was that Pythagoras said that the number 10, there are 10 dots in the triangle, that is the symbol of the sun. And those dots also are symbolic. They have to do with the cosmos as well, not just us. And the other thing that Pythagoras said is that number 2, he disliked that number. He disliked it so much because it represents our duality. He preferred the three because it's the higher consciousness, the triad. I wonder what you have to say about that.
Okay, that would be on you, Ken. But let me just ask Jonathan, how much time do we have? It's 44.
Yeah, 1 minute, but why
Okay.
don't you go maybe 10 minutes past?
Okay, 55 for those that can stay. Okay, thank you. Ken, you're on.
Yes. I think consciousness is fascinating, and tying what Maluka was talking about and what you mentioned about the content arising from the function. And again, it's like the potter and the clay. So one thing that's come out in Advaita Vedanta philosophy is the idea that every form is actually contained within the causation of the form. So the causation of the form in this case is the clay or the Brahman or the ultimate substance, and that contained within that is going to be the manifested thing that we experience: the bowl, the statue, the sculpture, the dice made out of clay, all those things. So in a sense, you could say consciousness, which you point out very nicely, Jean, that it's not the ultimate thing, it is a secondary phenomenon, consciousness. But that contained within consciousness is going to be all of the different diversities of manifested things that we experience, the content of consciousness. So I think that's a fascinating idea. And I hope that ties in what you were mentioning as well, Maluka.
Thank you, Ken. Laura.
We have Jonathan here in the audience.
You can see him. Well, let me get ladies first, and then we'll jump back to Jonathan.
Then we'll go back to Jonathan. Okay. Who we got there?
Laura.
Laura. Oh,
in
yes, Laura.
solving this idea of unity and oneness is going back to what Shobha said from The Light on the Path, where kill out all sense of separateness, stand alone, but you are not unique. And if we think that every being from an elemental to a great Mahatma has its changeless side and its changeable side. And the changeable side is made up of all the different elementals and elements in the universe that have their changeless side as well. And it brings us to what is said in the Upanishads, where all beings are the same in kind and differ only in degree, which leads us to what Nancy had indicated as well. But that everything and every life is in a steady march towards greater and greater awareness. But yet, at the core of each one of these beings is that changeless consciousness.
Okay, great. Thank you. And that kind of, if we might just kind of tie two unrelated things together that are related. In the chat, Richard Pouncey just gives us a reference, chaos theory, unraveling the universe with one simple equation. And when we look at that reference, and I'm sure it's on YouTube, and we recognize that there is only one life, and yet we have to account for Maya. And yet Maya, although an illusion, doesn't mean it's not real. Illusion doesn't mean non-reality. It just means it's illusory. And we experience that every day. We look at people, we have thoughts arise in our mind that we think are reflective of theirs, and we're living in our illusion of their experience, and we think it's correct, and we judge, or we are being judged, or whatever, and it's not the reality of the situation. And so when we begin to unclog our mind and stop jumping on the wrong interpretations, we can more clearly see the underlying realities that exist even within what we consider to be a Mayic state, whether we use terms like planes or states of consciousness or content of consciousness or nirvana or parinirvana, or as the teachers tell us, The nirvanas of the Pratyeka Buddhas are not the nirvanas of the Amita Buddhas. And so, on the one hand, this unchangeable nature that Laura is sharing with us is the very cause, through its own breath, as Ken suggested earlier, that creates the appearance of difference, although it is all one thing. And so I know David loves that comment in the Bhagavad Gita. You know, from Krishna, I established this entire universe with but a portion of myself and yet remain separate. And so that breath, that vohatic motion, those electrical elements that we designate with names and titles are really one thing. And when we can sit on that razor's edge and understand that and live in that fierce razor's edge moment, then we can begin to put together all of these apparent diversities in all of the sciences that we want or in all of the psychologicals that we want, but being driven by the love of compassion because we recognize there is only one. And then that Kuan Yin pledge becomes that reality. Richard has his hand up, and then you said Jonathan had something,
Yeah,
or Jonathan had something, or
I defer to Richard.
Okay.
okay. Richard?
Yeah, I'll make this very quickly here.
Yes.
Aqua and razor come to mind when I think about consciousness is sometimes that we kind of overthink things and we try to make it more complex than what we really want. You know, I looked at the first three letters of consciousness as con. And I looked that up and I was kind of amazed because, you know, we con ourselves into believing a lot of stuff that is really not true or not. And so we try to pictureize, you know, of this higher self. And but by no means, I'm not trying to tear down any established belief or something like that. What I'm
Please do.
stating is like, for me, it comes down to what is simply believed. You know, if we force ourselves to believe something, then it becomes our personal reality. So this con, you know, this observer, we're looking out and we've been told that things are certain this way and that things should be that way, and we believe it, and then that becomes our personal reality. So if we get back to the very basic, the awkward razor, you know, the very simplistic form of thing is what we observe and what we force ourselves or allow ourselves to believe. And I'll end with that.
Okay, thank you. A perfect example of Maya. Couldn't be much clearer. Jonathan's in there? Oh, I'm sorry, Ken.
I was going to say, Richard's comment exemplifies the idea from Adi Shankara that the illusion is actually a active mental construct. We actually create it ourselves, sort of like thinking that the rope is really a snake.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then you can let John, I don't know, I can't hear Jonathan, but you can.
Yes, yeah, we got Jonathan here.
You guys have touched on this a lot already. But I was wondering about the statement Tattva Masi. Whether or not I pronounced it right or not, I don't know. But that thou art, or thou art that, so forth. I was wondering if you could talk about that in relation to science, because I'm thinking of sciences. A lot of science, you can say a science is a system, an organized system, you know, the science of, I don't know, astrology or something. Or you can say that it's a process and the way that we look at things. And so you think of a scientist as being kind of cool, calm, collected, not exhibiting a lot of emotional content really, but just so that real precision can be had. But so identifying with that which does not change, that thou art, is that part of the scientific, of true science?
Ken?
Yes, fascinating question. For me, I would say modern Western science is about a variety of individual observers who think they're separate people, right? Doing an experiment or making an observation, writing it down, recording it, and then comparing notes with other observers in their lab and saying, oh, this is a real phenomenon. And so I think that's kind of the basis of science, is looking at things and at your level of awareness and comparing your observations to somebody else's observations, or 2 + 2 is 4, that sort of thing, doing an experiment and then getting a result most of the time. So yeah, well, this is mostly a reality. And Blavatsky talks about the adepts, and the whole perennial philosophy as having been created by adepts who over centuries and millennia looked at the spiritual world and compared notes with each other scientifically in that manner, and looking at what seems to be really a consensus reality, like Carlos Castaneda talks about. So since science moves us towards a consensus reality, a consensus perspective of reality that different observers agree to. But then ultimately behind all that, we have this mysterious question of what is the consciousness that these observers are using, like the observer on the Kshetra and Kshetrajna, and what is it that they're looking at? So all of that's, I think, the sort of meta aspect of science. And thou art that, tat tvamasi, I think is something that science, if you look at it as a spiritual discipline, like the adepts, is something that could lead you toward that understanding, that experience that Adi Shankara talks about, that you would get through studying the Vedas and meditating, and then have this experience of being identified with your higher self, with the Atman, and then that being identified with the Brahman, like Krishna, being part of you, but not all of you, and then you have these larger experiences. And thou art that, you might say, ultimately, like as you mentioned, Jean, about the different degrees of nirvana. Like in the Trikaya doctrine, we have the Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, Dharmakaya. And so you might say there's different degrees of awareness at those 3 different levels. But then the individual person, this advanced human, will then bring some of the awareness back into the Nirmanakaya to become a bodhisattva and to help us. And you might say that even at that level of the Trikaya doctrine, there is something beyond that, that they're still on a path themselves towards an ultimate awareness of Tat Tvamasi.
Okay, thank you very much. And we would say, I mean, we're looking at a book somewhere in our library here called The Void. And so there are scientists that know very well that the nature of life is void. And they have hundreds of examples of that. And yet out of that void is created virtual momentary life. And that virtual bubble within the void is no different than Brahma, the exhaustless, and Adhyatma. It is no different than the unmoved that Laura mentioned and the moved. And it is important to recognize that for those that are familiar with the teachings, T. Subbaro said that the difference between the Arhat and the Arhan is that the Arhat looks at the universe objectively and recognizes the void or the emptiness. The Arhan experiences it subjectively, and all of the states that sequentially arise from that little bubble. And hence they know it subjectively. And the true teacher that Ken mentioned in terms of those that can experience it experientially and compare and talk about it, embrace both. And that is allegedly the world of the theosophical student that would be more than a wannabe theosophist. That is the promise that's there, that is available. And we'll end with one more comment. I think Richard, his hand is up.
Yeah, I just want to say that in that documentary, Chaos Theory, after watching that, I've come to the idea, or I'm toying with the idea now that consciousness is really a fractal. No matter which direction you go, you will never find the boundaries or the end of it. It's not like the observer. There is no end. The alpha, the omega. It just keeps on replicating itself. Smaller and smaller or greater and greater. So we're kind of like in the middle. And if that fractal just keeps going on and on and on and on. So it's kind of like a dog chasing his own tail. We'll never find the end of it.
Okay, thank you. And that's interesting because we'll never find the end of it in an infinite universe. But if we step outside the universe, then we can begin to appreciate that which gives rise to the fractal. And again, this is what Theosophy is always pushing towards, that even that first unknown is knowable.
Mhm.
And so when we begin to really, and this is a weird thing, because the observer, even though the teachings in various forms love to talk about the supreme observer, even that gets lost in the original pristine condition. And yet there is something there that still has the ability to know. And HPB talks about that in the article, The Beacon of Life. So on that note, we'd like to thank you all for coming and listening and sharing and joining with us. And there will be more next week. So looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken and Jean.
Thank you.
Thank
Namaste.
you.
Yes. Will and desire.
Yes.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
A good one.
Thank you both.